The air on Vorlag was thin and sharp, tasting of iron and ozone. It was a world of jagged peaks that tore at storm-racked clouds, and its fortress monasteries were carved from the planet's very bones, monolithic structures that had stood for 10,000 years. For most of that time, they had borne the Imperial Aquila, a symbol of a distant pact made in an age of myth. Now, that symbol was gone. In its place, chiseled into the adamantium gates and woven into mile-long banners, was the snarling iron wolf's head of the first kings of Vorlag. The Imperium was a memory here, a fated oath drowned out by the thunderous roar of a resurgent past. Inside the great hall of the Iron Keep, the air was thick with the heat of 1,000 bodies, and the resonant hum of 10,000 tons of dormant war machines. Barons and scions from every noble house on the planet stood assembled, their power armor scarred and etched with lineage, their faces grim beneath crowns of blackened steel. They stood before the God Throne, a colossal seat of adamantium and obsidian built around the command interface of a knight paladin that had served since the dawn of the Great Crusade. And upon that throne, for the first time in millennia, sat a High King. His name was Thraxxan, and he wore the Iron Hand, a master-crafted thunderhammer that had shattered the spines of orc war bosses and the carapaces of tyrannid monstrosities. He was a giant even for his kind, his face a mask of ancestral certainty, his eyes burning with the cold fire of ambition. Upon his head rested the Crown of Sorrows, a jagged circlet of pitted iron said to have been forged from the first traitor's blade ever to strike a king on Vorlag. Today, it signified not grief, but vengeance. The ritual was complete. The blood of the stoneworm had been drunk, the oaths of fealty had been sworn upon the anvil of ages, and the planet-wide chorus of war horns had sounded their assent. Now came the proclamation. Thraxxan rose, the servos in, his ornate armor whining like captive beasts. The iron hand slammed against the throne's armrest, the crack echoing through the cavernous hall, silencing the assembled nobility, sons and daughters of Vorlag. His voice boomed, amplified by the vox grill of his helm, yet losing none of its raw power. For 10,000 years, we have kept the faith. For 100 centuries, we have honored the oath sworn by our ancestors to a golden king on a distant world. We gave our lances to his wars, our blood to his crusades. We held this iron bastion against the unending night, and we asked for nothing in return but the honor of our bond. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He gestured with a gauntleted hand towards the great vaulted windows, towards the bruised purple sky where the galaxy-spanning wound of the Great Rift pulsed with malevolent light. And where is the Allfather now? Where is the golden throne that once bound the galaxy in its light? It is a dying ember, and its servants are weaklings and oath-breakers. They left us isolated, alone, the Psychiatrix Maledictum, they call it. I call it a judgment, a sign that the pact is broken, that the age of Terra is over. They have failed us. They have failed the galaxy. They have failed themselves. A low growl of assent rumbled through the assembled barons. This was the sermon they had been hearing in whispers for decades, since the rift had torn reality asunder, isolating them completely. It was a truth forged in their solitude and bitterness. Our ancestors did not kneel to a bureaucracy of pallid scribes and soulless tax collectors. Thraxxan roared, his voice rising to a fever pitch. They swore allegiance to a vision of strength, of a human galaxy, united by martial prowess and iron will. That vision is dead in the heart of the Imperium, but it lives on here, in our blood, in our soil, in the sacred machine spirits of our knights. He raised the iron hand high, its power field, crackling to life with a halo of blue energy. The old maps remain, the star charts of the stellar kingdom of Vor, the domain our forefathers ruled before the men of Terra ever came. A kingdom of 100 worlds, a bastion of might that knew no equal. It is our birthright, lost, stolen, and forgotten by those we swore to serve. No more! The cry was a physical force, shaking dust from ancient tapestries depicting forgotten victories. Today we cast off the shackles of a failed oath. We are not servants of a dying empire. We are the masters of our own destiny. I declare a new crusade, a crusade of iron and righteous anger. We will ride forth from Vorlag, not as vassals, but as conquerors. We will reclaim what is ours. We will carve out our kingdom from the corpse of the Imperium. We will forge a new banner under which humanity will rally, a banner of true strength. The response was volcanic. 1,000 power fists slammed into 1,000 ceramite chests in a deafening unified salute. War cries in the harsh dialect of Old Vorlag echoed off the stone walls. The barons, whose pride and ambition had been constrained for centuries by their oaths, were now unleashed. They saw not treason, but liberation. From the observation galleries above, thousands of sacristans and serfs watched, their faces illuminated by the wild energy below. Outside, across the entire planet, the message was broadcast. In every fortress, knights were being roused from their slumber. Their colossal forms were anointed with sacred oils and unguents, their adamantium hides scrubbed of the tarnished iconography of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Imperial cult. Ancient banners, unseen for millennia, were unfurled, depicting the glorious conquests of the pre-Imperial kings. This was not a rebellion, it was an apotheosis. An entire world, a culture of warriors bred for honor and battle, had found a new, terrible purpose. As High King Thraxxan Ironhand stood before his roaring subjects, he looked out upon a force of over 5,000 knights, each a walking engine of destruction, all united by a single, burning conviction. The sky above the Iron Keep began to darken as the first wave of orbital transports. Colossal vessels, repurposed from their role as Imperial merchantmen, descended through the clouds. They were not coming to trade. They were coming to embark an army that would drown the neighboring Argentum reach in fire and blood. Far away, across the tempestuous tides of the warp, in a quiet astropathic relay station on the Imperial world of Praetoria IV, a sanctioned psyker screamed and clawed at his own eyes. His attendants rushed to restrain him as he babbled of a coming storm. His final broken message, whispered through a throat raw with terror, was of a crown of sorrows, a broken oath, and a crusade of iron that would know no mercy. The message was logged, filed, and marked for low priority analysis. The Imperium was vast and slow, and the Iron Crusade was already on its way. Xylos was a world made of prayer and industry. From orbit, its single great continent shimmered under the binary glare of its parent stars, a vast circuit board of tarnished brass and oxidized copper. Its seas were not water, but reservoirs of viscous, sacred unguents, and its mountains were slag heaps so ancient they had grown their own crystalline ecosystems. This was no forge world in the grand tradition of Mars or Ryza, but a forge shrine of the Third Order, a holy place dedicated to the solemn production of galvanic servitors, replacement limbs for the Imperial Guard, and the endless miles of wiring required to keep a hive city's life support systems from failing. It was a world of quiet, ceaseless diligence, where the only anthem was the percussive chant of the litanies of assembly and the only scripture was the binary cant of the machine god. Archmagos Dominus Vexchair, nominal governor of Xylos and protector of the blessed schematics, was observing the final consecration of Maniple Ku Delta's new cohort of Sicarian ruststalkers when the alarm cant wailed. It was not the shrieking klaxon of a Xenos raid or the bubbling psychic scream of a demonic incursion. It was a single, pure, logical chime of utter confusion that echoed through the noosphere, a query code that had not been activated in 3 millennia. The Augur Shrines were reporting a mass fleet translation at the system's Mandeville point. The signature was Imperial, the vessel classes matched those of system patrol frigates and heavy transports, yet their numbers were staggering, far exceeding any scheduled tithe fleet or military battle group, and their transponder cant was silent. Vexchair's organic brain matter, what little remained in his chrome-plated cranium, processed the anomaly with cold detachment. He dispatched logic probes into the noosphere, demanding clarification. The Skitarii legions across the continent halted their patrols, their heads snapping up in unison as their data tethers received the query. Onager dune crawlers swiveled their heavy weapons towards the heavens, their machine spirits humming with a sudden, unprogrammed agitation. The clarification never came. Instead, the sky caught fire. The Silent Fleet, a vast armada of angular transports and captured Imperial warships repainted in the gunmetal gray and blood red of Vorlag, did not pause for orbital overtures. It vomited its cargo directly into the upper atmosphere. Thousands upon thousands of dropkeeps, armored assault landers designed to carry knights, blazed through the thin air of Xylos, their re-entry trails scarring the sky like the talons of some monstrous raptor. They were a meteor shower of iron and hate, aimed squarely at the industrial heartlands of the planet. For the Skitarii of Xylos, war was a calculated equation of force application. They were masters of interlocking fields of fire, of data-tethered target acquisition, and massed volleys of precise lethal energy. They were wholly unprepared for this. This was not war as an equation, this was war as an avalanche. The first dropkeep slammed into the plains of brass dust surrounding the Grand Manufactorum of St. Valerius the Cog. Their assault ramps crashed down before the dust of their landing had even settled. And from their cavernous holds stormed the knights of House Tyrannus, their hulls painted with the ancient wolf's head sigil. A full lance of 5 Questoris knights charged forth, their stride shaking the very bedrock of the world. Leading them was Baron Maljast, his Knight Crusader Iron Vengeance, a walking fortress of death. The responding Scitarii maniple reacted with inhuman swiftness. A line of Scitarii rangers raised their galvanic rifles, unleashing a crackling volley of energy that sheeted across the knights' ion shields. The air sizzled and popped as the shields flared, absorbing punishment that would have vaporized a Lehman Russ tank column. But they held. Before the Scitarii could fire a second volley, the knights were upon them. The Gatling cannon on Maljast's knight spun to life, spitting a torrent of fist-sized shells that tore the Scitarii line to shredded metal and mangled flesh. His thermal cannon fired a moment later, its incandescent beam hitting a Sidonian dragoon and turning the stilt-walking war machine and its rider into a cloud of molten slag. Then the charge hit home. A knight gallant, armed with a Reaper chainsword the size of a hab-block, swept its blade through a phalanx of Cataphron breachers. The sound was of a giant tearing sheet metal, and the heavily armored cyborgs were simply erased, their torsos and tracks sent flying in a spray of oil and hydraulic fluid. This scene of one-sided butchery was repeated 1,000 times over across the continent. The Knights of Vorlag fell upon the unprepared Adeptus Mechanicus forces with the ferocity of predators. They were not interested in conquering territory in the traditional sense. They were smashing the enemy's ability to fight in a single overwhelming blow. Knight errants with thermal cannons melted servitor-crewed gun batteries from kilometers away. Knight Wardens unleashed storms of missiles from their carapace-mounted rocket pods, turning carefully arrayed ranks of Scitarii vanguard into craters of glowing blue glass. Yet the soldiers of the Omnissiah did not break. They could not. Flight was an illogical response to a tactical problem. Vexchair, from his command sanctum within the Logos Basilica, a cathedral of data stacks and cogitator shrines, retasked his legions with cold fury. He directed his forces to concentrate fire, to identify and overwhelm a single knight at a time. Iron Strider Ballistari, armed with twin-linked las cannons, darted between manufactorum stacks, firing precision shots at knightly joints and view slits. Scorpius disintegrators lobbed sizzling shells of plasma over the heads of their own troops, hoping to boil the pilots within their armored shells. They drew blood. A Knight Paladin from House Morton stumbled as a coordinated volley from 3 Onager Dunecrawlers blew its leg clean off at the knee. It crashed to the ground, helpless, and was systematically dismantled by swarms of Sicarian ruststalkers who swarmed over its hull, their transonic blades vibrating through its armor plating. Another knight, a younger scion in an Armiger warglaive, was caught in the open and simply disappeared in a blinding flash as the main gun of a Ordinatus Minoris, a relic weapon hidden within a forge shrine, fired its only shot. But for every knight that fell, 10 more rampaged unopposed. The scale of the assault was simply too great. The defenders of Xylos were an army, the invaders were a pantheon of angry gods. The main thrust of the invasion, led by High King Thraxxan himself, was aimed at the Logos Basilica. His personal banner, a trio of colossal Dominus-class knights, lumbered forward, their weapons spitting destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. Thraxxan's own Knight Tyrant, Oathbreaker, strode at their head. Its plasma decimator fired, and an entire wing of the Basilica, a structure that had stood for 6,000 years, ceased to exist in a miniature, roaring sun. Archmagos Vexchair watched his doom approach on a flickering data slate. His personal guard of Castellan robots, their phosphor blasters glowing cherry red, stood ready. He had unleashed his final reserve, a cohort of Thanatar siege automata, their helical plasma cannons charging with an ominous hum. For a moment, it seemed they might hold. The Thanatars unleashed a volley that struck a Knight Valiant accompanying the king, its Siegebreaker cannons and Thundercoil harpoon blasting through its ion shields and ripping its torso open. The knight exploded in a spectacular pyre of plasma and ceramite. Thraxxan did not even pause. He raised the colossal Thunderstrike gauntlet of Oathbreaker and pointed it at the Logos Basilica. For Vorlag, his voice boomed over a voxcaster that could shatter plasteel. For the Iron Kingdom! The answering volley from his 2 companions was the death of Xylos. A Knight Castellan fired its Volcano Lance, and a beam of pure starfire lanced across the battlefield, carving a trench 100 meters deep through the Scutari lines before striking the basilica's foundations. The ancient structure groaned, its sacred geometry failing. Then the Knight Valiant fired its conflagration cannon, bathing the building's lower levels in a liquid promethium fire that burned with the heat of a sun's core. The basilica, the heart and mind of the entire planet, began to collapse upon itself. Archmagos Vexcheer's last transmission was not a plea for aid or a curse upon his enemies. It was a stream of pure, agonized data, the death cry of 1,000,000,000,000 machine spirits as their temple was desecrated and destroyed. He and his entire command staff were crushed under 10 million tons of falling ferrocrete and blessed machinery. With the fall of the basilica, the Skittery resistance shattered. Deprived of their central command, their data tethers broadcasting only static, they fought on in isolated pockets, but their inhuman coordination was gone. They were cut down and crushed over the next several hours. By the time the twin suns of Xylos began to set, the battle was over. The red dust of the Forge Shrine was now black with soot and stained with the milky lubricants that passed for blood in the Omnissiah's soldiers. The air, once humming with the sound of productive machinery, now echoed with the triumphant war horns of the Knights of Vorlag. Thraxxan Ironhand stood in the ruins of the Logos Basilica, the massive foot of Oathbreaker crushing the symbol of the Adeptus Mechanicus into the dust. He had not just won a battle, he had secured the engine for his war. The remaining tech priests, rounded up and enslaved, would now service his knights. The vast Promethium reserves would fuel his fleets, the manufactorums would forge shells and armor for his crusade. The Iron Crusade had its first victory, and the Argentum Reach had received its first brutal lesson in the price of a broken oath. The conquest of Xylos was not an end, but the forging of a key. With the Forge Shrine's resources now bent to his will, High King Thraxxan did not pause to consolidate his rule or savor his victory. He was a force of pure momentum, and to halt was to invite the ponderous, grinding might of the Imperium to bear. From the bloodied command deck of his captured orbital command station, he unleashed the full fury of the Iron Crusade, not as a single fist, but as a trident of overwhelming force designed to shatter the Argentum Reach before it could even muster a coherent defense. This was the strategy he called the Iron Spear, a three-pronged blitzkrieg intended to dismember, terrorize, and conquer. The central prong, the shaft of the spear, he led himself. This was the hammer blow, a fleet of over 200 warships, many of them lumbering transports groaning with the weight of 3,000 knights from the most loyal and powerful houses. Their destination was the jewel of the sector, the teeming hive world of Hadrian's Spire, a planet whose population numbered in the hundreds of billions, and whose manufactorums supplied a dozen regiments of the Astra Militarum. To take Hadrian's Spire was to rip the heart from the imperial presence in the region. The second prong, the left-hand barb, was a fleet of swift Reaver-class vessels under the command of Baroness Vihorla, a cunning and ruthless warrior known as the Red Widow. Her lances, composed primarily of fast-moving armigers and stealth-capable knight assassins, were not to engage in pitched battles. Their task was to sow chaos. They would fall upon the soft underbelly of the sector, agri-worlds, isolated listening posts, and lightly defended refinery stations. Their goal was terror and disruption, to force the Imperium to spread its forces thin, chasing shadows while the main blow fell. The final prong, the right-hand barb, was an anchor, Baron Malhast. His reputation, now cemented by his brutal victory on Xylos, was given command of a powerful garrison force. He and his 1,000 knights would remain at Xylos, turning the Forge Shrine into an impregnable fortress and a forward supply base, ensuring the Iron Crusade's logistical chain remained unbroken. It was a strategy of breathtaking arrogance and speed, a gamble that the Imperium, in its bureaucratic sloth, could not possibly react in time. Far across the sector, in the void-shrouded command citadel of Port Argent, Admiral Vettius Corbulo proved him wrong. Corbulo was not a glorious warrior prince of the Imperial Navy. He was a man of logistics and attrition, his face a roadmap of weary campaigns, his mind a cold repository of fleet dispositions and supply timetable. When the astropathic screams from Xylos finally reached him, garbled and laced with the psychic stench of mass death, he did not panic. He saw the pattern instantly. This was not a raid. This was a conquest. From the strategium of his flagship, the grand cruiser, Dominus Astra, Corbulo began to move the vast, unwieldy pieces of his command. His bridge was a cathedral of war, where servitors moved with the slow grace of acolytes, and the air was thick with the scent of sacred machine oils and incense. Data slates and hololithic displays flickered with the icons of his battle group, Battlefleet Argentum. It was a force of some 60 capital ships and their escorts, a respectable fleet for a sector of its standing, but one spread thin across a dozen systems on patrol and anti-piracy duties. Recall all patrols. His voice was a low rasp, cutting through the chanted litanies of the bridge crew. All vessels are to rendezvous at the Praetorian Line, full muster. No exceptions. His strategy was the antithesis of Thraxxan's. Where the renegade king was all speed and aggression, Corbulo would be stone and patience. He would not chase the reavers or rush to meet the main enemy fleet head-on. Instead, he would form a wall. He designated a string of fortified Brand, star systems that formed a crescent around the sector's coreward territories. A defensive line he named the Aegis Chain. From the bastion system of Fortis Majoris in the galactic west to the night world of House Phelan in the east, he would position his ships, reinforce planetary garrisons, and dare the enemy to break themselves against him. The orders flowed from the Dominus Astra like a tidal wave of binary cant and astropathic whispers. Munitorum worlds were ordered to triple their output. Regiments of the Hadrian Spire Planetary Defense Force were mobilized and dug into positions that hadn't seen conflict in 1,000 years. The astropathic choirs of every world in the Aegis Chain screamed for aid, for reinforcements, a prayer cast into the uncaring void of the galaxy-wide Imperial war machine, a plea that might be answered in a decade or a century. Corbulo knew he was on his own. The Iron Crusade moved with a speed the Admiral could barely comprehend. Baroness Vihorla's Reavers were the first to make their presence known. The agri-world of Ceres Major sent a single panicked message of giant metal figures walking through fields of grain, their weapons burning crops and granaries alike, before it fell silent. A Navy listening post in the gaseous nebula of the Widow's Veil was found adrift and silent, its hull breached in a dozen places, its crew spaced. Panic, more corrosive than any weapon, began to spread through the sector's civilian populace. Refugee ships, laden with the terrified and the desperate, began to clog the warp routes, complicating Corbulo's fleet movements. Meanwhile, Thraxxan's main fleet, the Iron Spear Shaft, plowed through the void. A patrol squadron of 3 sword-class frigates, racing to join the Aegis Chain, stumbled directly into its path. They were not even afforded the honor of a battle. A single night transport, a repurposed Goliath-class factory ship, simply altered its course slightly and crushed the lead frigate like an insect. The other 2 were vaporized by the lance batteries of a captured lunar-class cruiser before they could even send a coherent warning. Corbulo watched the reports on his hololith, his face an impassive mask. He saw his pieces being swept from the board, but his eyes remained fixed on the main prize. The Aegis Chain was forming, the battleship Fist of Valor and its accompanying cruisers took up station at Fortis Majoris. His own flagship and the core of the fleet defended the central passage, and on the eastern flank he relied on the unwavering loyalty of House Phelan, a night world whose odes to Terra were as old and deep as Vorlag's had been. Their lances and orbital defense platforms formed a supposedly unbreakable anchor. The final piece of his plan clicked into place as the last squadron of destroyers confirmed their position. The Aegis Chain was active, a brittle, overstretched wall of ships and guns behind which lay the core worlds of the sector, and most importantly, Hadrian's Spire. It was the best he could do with the time and resources available. Now, all he could do was wait for the storm to hit. The wait was not long. On the bridge of the Dominus Astra, a sensorium servitor began to chime, its monotone voice cutting through the tense silence. Mass-scale warp translation detected. Quadrant Gamma Chair. Edge of the Hadrian system. Confirmed signatures match Renegade Fleet. Corbulo stared at the hololithic map. A swarm of angry red icons bloomed into existence just beyond the outermost planet of the system. The Iron Spear had arrived. It hung in the void, a vast fleet of dark metal and hostile intent, poised directly before the Crucible world that both he and Thraxxan had chosen as the fulcrum of this war. The grand strategies were complete. The feints and maneuvers were over. Now, the battle for a sector's soul would begin in earnest, in the trenches and shattered spires of Hadrian's Spire. Hadrian's Spire was a monument to humanity's stubborn refusal to die. It was a world of spikes and chasms, where hive cities clawed at a sky permanently bruised by their own effluence. These were not the elegant spires of Terra. but brutalist, utilitarian mountains of ferrocrete and plasteel, each home to more souls than 100 night worlds. The spaces between these hives were no less grim. Heme-blasted plains of gray dust, canyons carved by toxic runoff, and vast, fortified plazas designed for the mustering of armies. For millennia, the wardens of Hadrian's Spire had trained for a siege that never came, their lives a monotonous cycle of drill, discipline, and garrison duty. They were considered a backwater force, a tithe of bodies and materiel, but they were defending their home, and that made them a wall of grim, unyielding flesh. The sky broke without warning. The perpetually gray cloud cover was torn open by 1,000 incandescent trails of fire. The Iron Crusade did not bother with the niceties of orbital bombardment or a cautious landing in the blasted wastes. Thraxxan's strategy was one of pure, arrogant shock. His dropkeeps plunged directly towards the major hives, aiming for the great plazas that served as their gates. They fell like iron fists from heaven, their retro thrusters burning away the toxic haze and revealing for a moment the sheer, terrifying scale of the invasion. The first landing struck the Tartarus Plain, a 100-kilometer expanse of reinforced rockcrete before the primary gate of Hive Primus, the planetary capital. The impact of the dropkeeps was an earthquake. The ground buckled, and habblocks miles away shed facades of plasteel like dust. The forward defense lines of the Hadrian Spire Parshiparth mechanized infantry were simply obliterated, crushed into the earth before they could even fire a shot. Then the ramps fell. War horns, their voices deep enough to liquefy organs, bellowed a challenge that drowned out the roar of 1 billion panicked citizens within the hive. From the darkness of the landers, the Knights of Vorlag emerged. They were a vision from a forgotten, terrible age of gods. Hundreds of them, striding forth in perfect lances, their banners snapping in the chemical wind, their weapons cycling with hungry mechanical clicks. At their head was the banner of House Harkon, their knights painted a deep, menacing crimson, their pauldrons bearing the emblem of a striking manticore. Baron Drex of House Harkon surveyed the scene from the command throne of his knight paladin, Glory's End. Before him, stretching to the base of the hive, were the Imperial defense lines. Trenches zigzagged across the plain, dotted with razor wire and tank traps the size of hab units. Millions of guardsmen, tiny figures in drab fatigues, were scrambling into position, their lasguns looking like children's toys against the vista of the coming apocalypse. "Behold the Oath-Breaker's army," Drex's voice, a cultured sneer amplified by his vox, broadcast to his lances. "An army of insects, we shall grant them a swift, honorable death. For the High King! For Vorlag! Charge!" The advance of House Harkon was not a run, but a thunderous, ground-shaking stride. It was the advance of inevitability. The Imperial response was immediate and furious. 1,000 kilometers away, in fortified artillery pits hidden in the hive's lower abutments, Basilisk crews received their firing solutions. The earth shook with a different thunder as the cannons roared in unison. A creeping barrage of high-explosive shells walked its way across the Tartarus Plain, a rolling wall of fire and shrapnel that would have annihilated any conventional army. The knights walked through it. Explosions that could flip a lemon rust tank blossomed against their ion shields, causing the air to shimmer and crackle with discharged energy. Shrapnel the size of a man's head ricocheted from their adamantium hulls with sharp, ringing cracks. A few armigers, their shields weaker, staggered as direct hits found their mark, but the main line did not slow. Then they entered the range of the heavy weapons. From hidden bunkers and the firing slits of the outer curtain wall, last cannon beams, brilliant white lances of pure energy, stabbed out. Missiles trailed plumes of smoke as they streaked towards the Crimson Giants. Now the knights began to feel the sting. The ion shield of a knight-errant flared and died under a concentrated volley, and the next last shot speared through its cockpit, turning the noble scion within to superheated gas. The god machine slumped, headless, and crashed to the ground. But the price for that single kill was astronomical. Baron Drex identified the source of the heaviest fire and responded. The rapid-fire battle cannon on Glory's End barked twice, sending shells into the curtain wall. A 50-meter section of the fortification vanished in a spray of ferrocrete dust and mangled bodies. His Avenger Gatling cannon spun, spitting a sleet of shells that swept across the trench lines, turning flesh, bone, and flak armor into a red mist. The battle for the Tartarus Plain was a slaughter. It was the sublime, focused violence of the knights against the desperate, massed courage of the Imperial Guard. Entire platoons were vaporized by thermal cannon blasts. Leman Russ battle tanks, rumbling out to meet the charge, were swatted aside by Reaper chainswords or kicked over like pebbles. The guardsmen fought with suicidal bravery, charging forward with crack grenades to try and die beneath the feet of the metal giants, hoping to damage a joint or an actuator. They died in their tens of thousands. Their last fire a futile but defiant storm of light against the advancing demigods of war. In less than an hour, the plane was taken. The wreckage of hundreds of Imperial tanks and aircraft littered a landscape of craters and corpses. The Knights of House Harkon stood victorious before the Gorgon's Gate, the primary entrance to Hive Primus. But they were not unscathed. A dozen knights lay broken on the field, and nearly every machine bore the scars of the fight: pitted armor, damaged weapons, and strained machine spirits. This was only the beginning. As House Harkon prepared to breach the gate, similar scenes were playing out across the entire planet. At Hive Secundus, House Tyrannus found itself bogged down in a labyrinth of industrial refineries, where Cadian-trained grenadiers used the dense terrain to launch deadly ambushes. At Hive Tertius, the knights faced the cold, grinding reality of urban warfare. A knight gallant, charging gloriously down a macro thoroughfare, was brought down when demolition charges placed in the hab stacks on either side were detonated, burying the war machine under 1,000,000 tons of rubble. The pilots of Vorlag, raised on tales of chivalric duels on open plains, were learning the ugly, grinding mathematics of a Hive world siege. Every meter of ground was paid for in blood and ammunition. Every shattered hab block could hide a missile team. Every sewer grate a squad of veterans with meltabomb. Back at the Gorgon's Gate, Baron Drax found his glorious charge had stalled. The gate itself was a masterpiece of Imperial engineering. 100 meters of solid adamantium braced by void shield generators. His knights poured fire into it, but the shields held, shimmering defiantly. And from the murder holes and battlements above, the Hadrian Spire wardens poured down a relentless torrent of fire. Heavy bolters chattered, autocannons barked, and last fire never ceased. The area before the gate became a kill zone. The war for Hadrian's Spire had begun. The Iron Crusade had proven its power, shattering the initial defenses with contemptuous ease. But the Hive world had proven its resilience. It was a wounded beast, vast and bleeding, but its heart was still beating. It would not be conquered in a day or a week. Its spires would be a crucible, and the fires within would test the iron will of Vorlag and the fleshy resolve of the Imperium alike. For every soul that died, 10 more were there to take their place, their hatred a fresh whetstone for the edge of war. The Gorgon's Gate was more than a mere entrance. It was a fortress within a fortress, a bastion of defiance carved into the lowest, widest level of Hive Primus. For 3 weeks, it had been the focal point of the war for Hadrian's Spire, a microcosm of the entire brutal campaign. Day after relentless day, the Knights of House Harkon hurled themselves against its adamantium hide, their glorious charges blunted by a defense so stubborn, so utterly devoid of chivalry, that it bordered on profane in their eyes. The ground before the gate was a graveyard of giants, the husks of fallen knights lying amidst the twisted wrecks of Imperial tanks, a testament to the grinding attrition that had replaced the war's initial, swift brutality. The architect of this defiance was Castellan Valerius, a man whose name was beginning to be whispered with awe in the vox chatter of the beleaguered defenders and with frothing hatred in the war cants of the invaders. Valerius was not a native of Hadrian's Spire. He was a son of Cadia, a ghost from a world that was no more, one of the handful of the old Kaskin shock troopers who had been attached to the Hadrian PDF as advisors years before the Great Rift. He had the pallor of a man who had spent his life under fortress lights, and the eyes of someone who had stared into the heart of chaos and had not flinched. He did not speak of glory or honor. He spoke of firing lanes, kill zones, and the mathematics of acceptable losses. From his command center, deep within the gatehouse complex, a cramped bunker buzzing with the frantic energy of vox operators and tactical plotters, Valerius waged his war. He had treated the knights not as mythical beasts, but as oversized tanks with identifiable weaknesses. His first order had been to mine the entire Tartarus plain, with city-killing demolition charges to be detonated sequentially to funnel the charging knights into the interlocking fire of concealed Shadow Sword and Stormblade super-heavy tanks. He had turned the Hive's immense ventilation shafts into conduits for chemical agents, pumping corrosive smog into the faces of the advancing war machines to blind their augurs. He treated his own soldiers as another resource, callously but effectively, ordering entire regiments to sacrifice themselves in suicidal charges to lure knights into ambushes. He was a butcher, but he was a butcher who was holding the line. His greatest triumph, and the source of Baron Malhast's seething rage, had been the defense of the upper battlements. Malhast, Thraxxan's most feared champion, had arrived from Xylos to break the stalemate, his personal lance of veteran knights tasked with shattering the Gorgon's Gate. He had led a direct assault, his knight crusader Iron Vengeance striding through a hail of fire. But Valerius had been ready. As Malgast approached the walls, Valerius had unleashed his secret weapon, the Hive's industrial infrastructure. From hidden gantries high up the Hive's spire, massive cranes, once used to lift promethium containers weighing thousands of tons, swung out on immense chains. At their ends were not claws, but entire hab blocks, gutted and filled with explosives. These colossal wrecking balls were swung down on the advancing knights. The effect was devastating. One knight was simply smashed flat, its reactor going critical in a flash of blue-white energy. Another was knocked from its feet, flailing as it fell, and was quickly dispatched by concentrated fire from the walls. Malgast himself had been forced into a humiliating retreat as a falling block of ferrocrete, the size of a cathedral nave, crashed down where he had stood moments before, the shockwave nearly shearing the leg from his knight. The failed assault cemented two legends. For the knights, Malgast became a figure of terrible fury, his failure galvanizing his resolve to raise the Hive to its foundations. For the defenders of Hadrian's Spire, Valerius became a saint of the battlefield. The guardsmen, who had been on the verge of breaking, now fought with renewed fanaticism. They called him the Iron Castellan, the Cadian ghost who could slay giants. His image, a grim, determined face beneath a Cassarcan helmet, was stenciled onto the sides of tanks and the walls of bunkers. He was no longer just a commander. He was a symbol that the Imperium, even here at the edge of the abyss, did not yield. His command tank, a Baneblade by the designation Will of Iron, became his mobile fortress. It was a relic of a forgotten war, its hull pockmarked and scarred, each blemish a story of survival. From its cupola, Valerius directed the battle with an unnerving calm. He was a constant presence at the front, his tank's coaxial autocannon spitting tracers into the fray, its main battle cannon felling any armiger that strayed too close to the walls. He lived, breathed, and slept the defense of the Gorgon's Gate. The confrontation that would forge his legend into scripture came on the 27th day of the siege. Malhast, his pride wounded and his hatred perfected, planned a final, decisive stroke. Under the cover of a brutal orbital bombardment that forced the defenders deep into their bunkers, his sacristans and enslaved tech priests worked feverishly. They constructed a monstrous siege ram, a 100-meter-long battering ram with a screaming daemon visage of welded iron, propelled by the engines of a downed Imperial Valkyrie. As the bombardment lifted, the assault began. A full 30 knights charged, a wave of crimson and steel, providing a curtain of fire for the ram as it was pushed towards the gate by a dozen lumbering industrial tractors. Valerius was waiting. "All batteries target the ram," he ordered, his voice flat and cold over the command vox. "Super heavies, engage the lead knights. Infantry, hold your fire until they are within 50 meters. Make every shot a prayer to the Emperor's wrath." The Will of Iron lurched forward, its sponson blazing. Its demolisher cannon fired, the shell arcing high and exploding against the ram's chassis, barely scratching its thick hide. Last cannons and missiles streaked from the walls, most splashing harmlessly against the ion shields of the screening knight. The ram was moving slowly, but it was unstoppable. "It is not enough," Valerius stated. A simple observation of impending doom. He watched the tactical plot, his mind racing through calculations. The ram would hit in 90 seconds. The gate would not hold. The Hive would fall. He looked at the icon of Malgus Knight, Iron Vengeance, directing the assault from the rear, a triumphant king surveying his victory. A new plan, born of pure Cadian pragmatism, formed in his mind. "Box officer," he snapped, "patch me through to the Gorgon's Gate primary command. Authorization Valerius Omega Chair. Order the void shield generators to overload. Full, catastrophic discharge. On my mark." There was a moment of stunned silence. A catastrophic discharge would not just repel the attack, it would vaporize a 2-square-kilometer area in front of the gate, including everything and everyone in it. It would also permanently burn out the generators, leaving the gate itself undefended. Castellon, the Vox officer stammered, that includes our own forward trenches, the Pekshibith and the Pekshipsath regiments. They know their duty, Valerius replied, his voice devoid of emotion. Send the order. He turned to his own crew. Driver, advance. Full speed. Gunner, target Malhas's knight. We are going to give that bastard something to look at. The will of iron surged forward, out from the comparative safety of the gate's shadow and into the apocalyptic storm of the battle. It was an act of suicidal insanity, a single super-heavy tank charging an army of knights. Shells and energy blasts immediately hammered its hull. Warning runes flashed across the control panels. Ignore them, Valerius commanded, standing exposed in the respond. Cupola, his bolt pistol in hand. Just get me in range. The ram was now 50 meters from the gate. Malhast, seeing the lone tank's charge, focused the guns of Iron Vengeance. Upon it, a scornful execution. A thermal cannon blast struck the Baneblade's turret, melting a meter of armor and slagging the main gun. The tank shuddered to a halt, crippled. Now! Valerius screamed into the Vox. At the Gorgon's gate, a tech priest slammed a final rune switch. Deep in the earth, generators the size of hab blocks whined to an impossible crescendo. For a moment, all sound ceased. Then the air in front of the gate turned to blinding white light. A wave of pure energy, silent and absolute, erupted outwards. The siege ram, the tractors, and the first two lines of charging knights simply vanished. Their constituent atoms blasted apart. The ground was scoured clean, fused into a sheet of black, glassy obsidian. The shockwave, when it came a second later, shattered every window in a 10-mile radius. The will of iron, caught at the very edge of the blast, was thrown backwards like a child's toy, its tracks sheared off, its hull glowing cherry red. Inside, the crew were dead, cooked alive by the wave of heat. But by some miracle of the Emperor's grace, or perhaps just his own inhuman stubbornness, Valerius, shielded by the tank's bulk, survived. He was thrown from the cupola, his body broken and burned, but he was alive. He lay in a crater, his world a blur of pain and roaring static, and looked up. Through the smoke, he saw Baron Malghast's knight, Iron Vengeance, still standing. It was battered, its ion shield gone, its armor scorched, but it was functional. The Baron had survived, but his assault was broken. His forces were in disarray, stunned by the sheer, suicidal ferocity of the defense. He looked down at the single broken man and the wrecked tank that had defied him. And for the first time in the campaign, Baron Malghast knew something akin to fear. He gave the order to retreat and consolidate. Valerius, the Iron Castellan, had held the gate. He had sacrificed 2 regiments and the gate's primary defense, but he had bought Hadrian's Spire another day. As Medicaid teams rushed on to the newly created glass plane to retrieve his shattered body, his legend was no longer just a story. It was the gospel of Hadrian's Spire, a tale of a man who forged victory from certain doom, a legend born in the fires of a god's fury. On the command deck of the Grand Cruiser, Dominus Astra, silence was a currency more valuable than adamantium. Admiral Vettius Corbulo stood before the Grand Hololith, a shimmering ghost map of the Argentum Reach that filled the center of the Strategium. For weeks, he had watched that map bleed. The icon representing the siege of Hadrian's Spire was a festering wound of angry crimson. Further out, the lightning raids of Baroness Vihorla's Reavers had turned a dozen green system markers to a sickly, ambiguous amber. Their statuses unknown, their communications silenced. His Aegis chain, the grand strategy upon which he had staked the sector, was not a wall of iron, it was a picket fence with entire sections kicked in, and the wolves were now roaming freely in the fields beyond. His patient strategy of containment was failing. Attrition was a game the Imperium usually won, but Thraxxan's blitzkrieg had upset the board. The Iron Crusade was being supplied by a constant stream of materiel from the conquered forges of Xylos, while Corbulo's own forces were stretched to the breaking point. His ships forced to conduct endless patrols, their crews running on stims and faith. The pressure from Sector Command, a stream of insistent but unhelpful astropathic demands for a decisive counterattack, was becoming a dull roar in the back of his mind. Another report from the Hadrian blockade, my lord, Captain Gracchus, the Dominus Astra's flint-eyed master, stated, his voice carefully neutral, the renegades have landed another full lance of knights. Our picket ships were unable to intercept. They estimate Castellan Valerius can hold the Gorgon's Gate for another week. Perhaps, Corbulo did not turn. He traced a finger along the faint line on the hololith that represented the Renegade supply route, a well-traveled warp corridor between Xylos and Hadrian's Spire. A week, and then the heart of this sector is ripped out and our cause is lost. The High King will have a fortress, a recruitment base of billions, and a symbol of our failure. We could consolidate the fleet, Gracchus offered. The suggestion tasting of heresy even as he spoke it. Pull back from the Aegis chain and meet their blockade fleet in a decisive engagement. Corbulo finally turned his gaze heavy. And we would die, Gracchus. Gloriously, I am sure, but we would die. Thraxxan's fleet is built around his transports. It is a fleet of hammers and anvils. Ours is a fleet of scalpels and shields. We would break upon their hulls, and he would barely notice. No, you do not fight a giant by punching him in his iron jaw. He looked back at the map, his finger tapping the supply line. You fight him by cutting his Achilles tendon. The Admiral's plan was one of sublime, desperate risk. He had been tracking the Vorlag supply convoys for weeks, using cloaked recon servitors and long-range auger probes. The convoys were heavily escorted, but they were predictable. They traveled in waves, and to navigate the treacherous warp currents stirred by the Great Rift, they had to converge on a single, stable, real space passage. A vast, turbulent nebula known as St. Drusus's Veil. It was a stellar nursery and a starship graveyard, a place of sensor ghosts and gravitic tides where fleets could pass within 1,000 kilometers of each other and never know it. It was the perfect place for an ambush. "Recall the fleet," Corbulo commanded, his voice now imbued with a sudden cold authority that silenced the deck. "Every battle-worthy ship, we are abandoning the Aegis chain. We make for the Veil. We will let the wolves have the fields so that we might trap the shepherd." The gamble was immense. To pull his ships from their defensive positions was to invite the renegades to sweep through the outer systems unopposed. It was to sacrifice worlds to save a sector. The orders were sent, and over the next Tirshibby hours, Battlefleet Argentum vanished from Imperial auger screens. Like a pack of wraiths, they converged on the churning multi-hued clouds of St. Drusus's Veil, their engines running cold, their voxcasters silenced, their every system rigged for stealth. The fleet crept into the nebula's dense heart, hiding within the sensor shadow of a protostar, and waited. For 6 days, they waited in the suffocating silence of the void, the crew on edge, the ship's machine spirit groaning in protest at the imposed stillness. Then, the trap was sprung. The renegade convoy translated into real space at the predicted coordinates. It was even larger than Corbulo had anticipated. At its core were 3 Goliath-class factory ships, mobile foundries capable of repairing battle-damaged knights in transit, and a dozen hulking transports laden with ammunition, fuel, and replacement parts. Screening them was a captured squadron of Imperial warships led by the Tyrant-class cruiser, Indomitable Will, now renamed the Oathkeeper's Fury. They entered the nebula with an arrogance born of unchallenged supremacy. On the bridge of the Dominus Astra, Corbulo watched the red icons resolve on his tactical display. All ships. He voxed, his voice a whisper that carried across the entire fleet. Execute the Drusus Gambit, for the Emperor and for Argentum. The first shot was fired by the Dominus Astra itself. Its dorsal lance batteries, powered by a city-sized reactor, fired as one. 4 beams of incandescent energy, impossibly bright against the dark dust of the nebula, crossed the void in an instant and struck the lead Goliath transport. There was no explosion. The colossal vessel was simply pierced through, its spine broken. It split in 2, its internal atmosphere erupting in a flash of crystallizing ice, its precious cargo of night components spilling into the void like scattered jewels. The ambush was total. From out of the swirling clouds of purple and green gas, Battlefleet Argentum appeared, their prows lit by the sudden glare of their own weapon systems. Nova cannons fired, their city-sized projectiles hurtling through the void to detonate amidst the helpless transports. Waves of torpedoes, their plasma warheads glowing, streaked from the launch bays of cruisers and destroyers. The Vorlag support fleet, caught completely by surprise, was plunged into a maelstrom of fire and death. Transports broke apart, their reactors overloading in silent, brilliant flashes that illuminated the carnage. But the renegade escorts were crewed by fanatics. The Oathkeeper's Fury and its attendant frigates reacted with suicidal speed, turning to face the ambush, their own guns blazing. The battle devolved from a clinical execution into a chaotic, close-range brawl within the nebula's disorienting confines. Ships became vast, dark shapes glimpsed through clouds of plasma, their hulls hammered by macro-cannon shells and ripped open by lance strikes. The Dauntless-class cruiser, Vigilant, charged the Oathkeeper's fury, its guns firing at point-blank range, its captain screaming vengeance for his fallen homeworld. The two ships tore at each other like prehistoric beasts, until a volley from the renegade cruiser's main batteries struck the Vigilant's bridge, silencing it forever. Another Imperial ship, the frigate Argent Blade, was rammed by a crippled Vorlag destroyer, the two vessels becoming a single, spinning tomb of tangled metal and fire. Corbulo's own flagship was locked in a brutal duel. The Dominus Astra traded broadsides with the Oathkeeper's fury, the impacts shaking the Grand Cruiser to its keel. The bridge was a scene of controlled chaos. Servitors sparked and fell, consoles exploded, and the deck plating groaned under the strain. A salvo of plasma torpedoes struck their port side, and the entire ship listed, its port void shield generator failing, with a deafening shriek of tortured machinery. "Target their bridge!" Corbulo roared over the din, clinging to the command throne's railing. "Full broadside! Fire everything!" The Dominus Astra unleashed its fury. Hundreds of macro-cannon shells, each the size of a municipal transport, slammed into the renegade cruiser. Its shields, already weakened, collapsed, and the shells tore into its superstructure. The final shell found its mark, striking the armored bridge tower. The Oathkeeper's fury went dark and silent, drifting now, its command structure decapitated. The battle was over. The renegade convoy was annihilated. The vital supplies that were the lifeblood of the Iron Crusade were now radioactive dust and drifting wreckage. The objective was achieved, but the price? Corbulo stood on his shattered bridge, the stench of burned ozone and cooked flesh thick in the air. He looked at the hololith, where once there had been 60 icons for Battlefleet Argentum, now less than 30 remained green. The rest were amber, signifying crippling damage, or stark, unforgiving red. He had lost the battleship Fist of Valor, 6 cruisers, and over a dozen escort frigates. He had crippled Thraxxan's ability to wage a prolonged war, but in doing so, he had spent his fleet. He had sacrificed his sword to break the enemy's spear shaft. As the casualty reports began to filter in, listing tens of thousands of dead, the victory felt as cold and empty as the void outside. The Nightworld of Phelan was the jewel of the Aegis Chain's eastern flank. Unlike the brutalist iron-bound fortresses of Vorlag, Phelan was a world of breathtaking, albeit savage, beauty. Its continents were lush, feral jungles of crimson and indigo flora, broken by mountain ranges that glittered with veins of pure, unrefined adamantium. Its fortresses, the keeps of the ruling knightly houses, were elegant spires of white marble and polished obsidian that rose from the jungle canopy, like the bones of sleeping gods. For 10 millennia, House Phelan had been a paragon of loyalty, its banners proudly displaying the Imperial Aquila alongside their own sigil of the Viridian Drake. They were the anchor of Admiral Corbulo's defensive strategy, a bastion of chivalry and honor that was believed to be utterly incorruptible. The belief was a lie, rotted from within by the slow-acting poison of pride. The High Baron of Phelan, a venerable and ancient warrior named Tybalt, had watched the rise of Thraxxan Ironhand with a complex mixture of contempt and envy. Contempt for the Vorlag king's brutish, unsubtle methods, but a burning envy for his audacity. For generations, the nobles of Phelan had felt the stifling grip of the Imperium not as a comforting embrace, but as a leash. They were frustrated by the endless tithes, the condescending authority of administratum officials who knew nothing of honor, and the slow decay of an empire they had sworn to protect. The coming of the Great Rift, which had isolated them just as it had Vorlag, had been the final catalyst. It had shown them that the Imperium was mortal, its promises of protection hollow. When the astropathic messages from Admiral Corbulo arrived, pleading for House Phelan to hold the line, they were received with cold formality. Tybalt and his council of barons saw not a request from an ally, but a demand from a master who had already abandoned them. They saw Corbulo's fleet, diminished and bloodied after the battle, in St. Drusus's Vale, not as a symbol of sacrifice, but as proof of the Imperium's weakness. Thraxxan, for all his savagery, was winning. He was forging a new kingdom from the ashes of the old, a kingdom ruled by the worthy, by the nobility of the knights. It was a vision that resonated deeply with the proud warriors of Phelan. The decision was made in the Chamber of Echoing Oaths, beneath a vaulted ceiling that depicted the moment their ancestors had sworn fealty to the Emperor. The air was thick with tension as Tybalt, his ancient face a mask of regal certainty, rose from his command throne. He did not need to shout like Thraxxan. His voice was a low, cultured rasp that carried more weight than any roar. For 10,000 years, he began, the Viridian drake has slept, dreaming of its duty to a golden master. But the master has fallen into slumber, and his keepers have let the house fall into ruin. A wolf now howls at the door, but it is a wolf of our own kind. It reminds us of what we are, not servants, but lords. The age of fealty is over. The age of dominion is at hand. He drew a ceremonial power sword, its blade humming with ancient energy, and pointed it at the great tapestry depicting the emperor. The old oath is dust. Today we swear a new one, an oath to ourselves, an oath to House Phelan. There was no savage roar as there had been on Vorlag. Instead, the assembled barons and scions rose as one and drew their own blades, the sound of 100 power swords igniting in unison, a sharp, hungry hiss that echoed the chamber's name. The betrayal was absolute, decided not in the heat of passion, but in the cold calculus of ambition. The Imperial forces garrisoned in the Phelan system were the first to pay the price for their misplaced faith. 3 regiments of Mordian Iron Guard, stationed on Phelan's primary moon as a gesture of Imperial trust, found themselves facing their hosts as enemies. The attack came at dawn. A full lance of knights from House Phelan descended from the sky on dropkeeps, their hulls now bearing freshly painted symbols of the Viridian drake over the crudely scrubbed-out Aquilus. They landed directly in the heart of the Mordian command fortress, their charge a perfectly executed manu uvu of shocking treachery. The Mordians, famed for their discipline, fought back with disciplined fury. Lascanon crews, still in their sleeping fatigues, rushed to their emplacements. Heavy weapon teams laid down blistering fields of fire. But they were surrounded, betrayed, and hopelessly outmatched. The Knights of Phelan, elegant and precise where the Knights of Vorlag were brutal, dismantled the Imperial defense with the cold grace of a surgeon. A Knight Lancer, its shock lance crackling with energy, speared through the fortress's command bunker, impaling the Mordian colonel and his entire staff in a single, contemptuous thrust. The battle was over in an hour. The survivors were rounded up, their pristine uniforms stripped from them, and they were put to work in the adamantium mines as slaves. Simultaneously, in the void above Phelan, the treachery played out on a grander scale. Admiral Corbulo, his fleet still limping back from the Vale, had left behind a rearguard squadron to protect the Phelan anchor point. It was commanded by the young, promising Commodore Eva Roscoff of the Dauntless-class cruiser Righteous Fury. Her 3 cruisers and half-dozen escorts were confident in their position, nestled within the protective envelope of Phelan's powerful orbital defense platforms. The platforms turned on them without warning, lance batteries that had been silent for a century. Spat emerald beams of energy, not at the void, but at the Imperial ships they were sworn to protect. The first volley caught the Righteous Fury completely by surprise, gutting it from stern to stem. Its reactor went critical, and the pride of the squadron vanished in a silent, expanding sphere of white-hot plasma. Commodore Roscoe's last transmission was a single, choked cry of disbelief that was cut short by the fires of her own destruction. The remaining Imperial ships, stunned and crippled, were easy prey. From the dark side of Phelan's moon, a hidden fleet of Phelan warships, their hulls painted in the deep green of the jungle, emerged to finish the slaughter. It was a massacre, a perfectly executed betrayal that shattered the eastern flank of the Aegis chain utterly. The news reached Admiral Corbulo as the Dominus Astra was undergoing emergency repairs at the fleet anchorage of Port Argent. The astropath who received the fragmented, horror-laced report collapsed into a bloody heap, his mind shattered by the psychic backlash of such profound treachery. When the decoded message was placed before Corbulo, the weary admiral simply stared at it for a full minute, his face aging a decade. His victory at St. Drusus's Vale was now meaningless, a hollow, pyrrhic gesture. He had sacrificed half his fleet to cut off the enemy's arm, only for his own spine to be broken from behind. A second front was now open. The renegade Knights of Phelan, fresh and numbering in the thousands, could now sweep through the undefended eastern systems at their leisure. The entire strategic situation had collapsed. The Argentum Reach was no longer a sector under siege. It was a sector being devoured from 2 sides. The Iron Crusade had found an ally, and the Imperium's flickering hopes in this forgotten corner of the galaxy had been all but extinguished. War is a furnace, and the Argentum Reach was now burning from end to end. The cost, once measured in regiments and warships, was now tallied in worlds. The betrayal of House Phelan had not merely opened a second front, it had broken the dam of Imperial control. Chaos, not the neatly defined fronts of a strategic map, now ruled the sector. The war had become a plague, and its symptoms were starvation, terror, and the utter collapse of faith in the Emperor's protection. The logistical nightmare that descended upon the remnants of Admiral Corbulo's command was a slow, grinding apocalypse of its own. Port Argent, the sector's primary naval base, became a purgatory. Its orbital docks, designed to service a fleet of 100 ships, were now choked with the crippled survivors of St. Drusus's Vale. Vessels that should have been decommissioned for years were patched with raw plating and sent back out with skeleton crews, their machine spirits screaming in protest. The flow of Promethium, once a steady river from the sector's refinery moons, had slowed to a trickle as Baroness Vihorla's reavers and the new Phelan warbands preyed upon the lumbering tankers. Ships were forced to undertake missions with half-empty fuel tanks, their captains knowing they likely did not have enough power to return. Ammunition was more precious than life. Macro cannon shells were rationed, and lance batteries were permitted to fire only on a direct command from a flag officer. Battlefleet Argentum was dying a death of 1,000 cuts, not from enemy action, but from the simple, inexorable mathematics of supply. On the ground, the situation was grimmer still. Worlds that had been abandoned when Corbulo consolidated his fleet for the Drusus Gambit were now paying the price of his strategy. The Agri world of Gethsemane Prime, breadbasket for 3 subsectors, was overrun by the elegant, cruel knights of House Phelan. They did not burn the fields as the warriors of Vorlag might have. They enslaved the population, forcing them to work to death to feed their new masters. Astropathic pleas from Gethsemane became weaker and more desperate, telling tales of mass executions and nobles hunting farm workers for sport before they ceased entirely. Billions of Imperial citizens in nearby systems were now facing the prospect of mass starvation. The tide of refugees became a human flood, a torrent of desperation that overwhelmed everything in its path. Ancient transports, bulk freighters, and even hollowed-out asteroids drifted through the warp, their passengers crammed into conditions of unimaginable squalor. They fled from the advancing knights, their minds filled with terrifying rumors of metal giants that could not be stopped. These refugee fleets were a menace in themselves. They clogged stable warp routes, interfered with military deployments, and were easy prey for the pirates and reavers who flourished in the anarchy. More than one convoy, upon arriving at a system they believed to be safe, translated from the warp only to find that it too had fallen, their flight ending in the weapon batteries of their pursuers. Hadrian's Spire remained the epicenter of the suffering. The victory at the Gorgon's Gate, which had so briefly lifted the spirits of the defenders, now seemed a distant memory. The destruction of the supply convoy had starved Thraxxan's forces of heavy ordnance and fresh knights, but it had not broken their will. Instead, it had made them more savage. The war for the Hive world devolved into a meat grinder of unprecedented scale. Unable to breach the main gates, the Knights of Vorlag began a systematic campaign to destroy the Hive from the outside in. They used their immense firepower to collapse the upper spires, sending millions of tons of ferrocrete and plasteel crashing down into the hab levels below. Entire districts, home to tens of millions of people, were simply erased, buried under mountains of their own homes. The defenders, led by the recovering Castellan Valerius, fought back with the grim tenacity of cornered rats. With the flow of off-world supplies cut off, they turned to desperate measures. Munitorum priests reactivated ancient, barely understood STC fragments, producing crude but effective firearms that were prone to exploding in their users' hand. The Hive's gangers, once a plague upon the populace, were conscripted en masse, their savage close-quarter skills put to use in suicidal boarding actions against immobilized knights. Children were sent scurrying through ventilation ducts to plant makeshift explosives on the legs of the war machines. Every citizen of Hadrian's Spire was now a soldier, and their city was both their fortress and their tomb. The cost was measured in the very air they breathed. The constant bombardment, the detonation of night reactors, and the fires that burned unchecked in the underhives had poisoned the atmosphere beyond recovery. The recycled air within the hive became thick with toxins and the fine dust of pulverized corpses. A hacking cough known as the spire shakes became pandemic, weakening the defenders more than any weapon. Food and water were strictly rationed, and the sight of bodies being rendered down for protein in the corpse starch factories became a grimly accepted reality of daily life. Hope, once a fervent prayer to the emperor, was now a quiet personal luxury that few could afford. Even the Knights of Vorlag were paying a terrible price. The attrition was horrific. For every 100 meters of hive wall they destroyed, another knight would fall, brought down by a lucky missile strike, a hidden minefield, or the sheer weight of concentrated last fire from 1,000 desperate hands. The sacristans, working with enslaved tech priests from Xylos, labored endlessly to repair the damaged machines, but their resources were finite. The noble scions, once eager for glory, now climbed into their command thrones with a grim fatalism. The glorious crusade was now a bitter, grinding war of extermination, and the honor they sought was buried under an ever-growing mountain of rubble and death. The Argentum Reach was no longer a prize to be won. It was a wound in the fabric of the galaxy, weeping blood and pus, and its infection was spreading with every passing day. The Strategium of Port Argent was no longer a place of grand plans. It was a vigil room for a dying sector. Hololithic displays blinked red with casualty reports and lost territories. The air, once cool and sterile, was now stale, with the smell of recycled air and defeat. Admiral Corbulo had not left the chamber in weeks, sustained only by nutrient paste and a dwindling reserve of grim determination. His fleet was a ghost of its former self. His defenses were non-existent, and the advance of the allied renegade knights was a slow, inexorable tide of death. Before him lay two options: a glorious but pointless final stand, or an order for a full-scale retreat, abandoning the Argentum Reach and 1,000,000,000 souls to their fate. It was in this atmosphere of utter despair that a third option arrived, unbidden and unwelcome. The emissary did not announce himself through official channels. The reinforced adamantium doors to the Strategium simply hissed open, and a figure cloaked in the sable robes of the Officio Assassinorum stepped through, flanked by two hulking crusader automata whose power fields hummed with latent violence. The guards on the bridge did not even raise their weapons. Their minds were clouded by a subtle psychosuggestion that told them this intrusion was perfectly normal. The assassin was a woman, her face a pale, emotionless mask beneath her hood. Only her eyes, cold and dark as the void between stars, held any sign of life. She moved with a silence that was more profound than the absence of sound. She stopped before Corbulo's command throne and placed a small obsidian data slate on the hololithic projector. "By the authority of the High Lords of Terra, Execution Force Cassius is sanctioned," she stated, her voice a synthesized whisper that seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves. "Lord Militant Obidian of Segmentum Command has invoked the right of retribution. The political and strategic integrity of the Argentum Reach is deemed secondary to the elimination of the arch-heretic Thraxxan Ironhand." Corbulo stared at her, then at the data slate. The seal of the Officio Assassinorum glowed with an ominous internal light. This was a level of authority far beyond his own, a final desperate measure from the highest echelons of the Imperium. They were not sending armies or fleets, they had sent a single living weapon. "You believe one assassin can succeed where my entire battle fleet has failed?" Corbulo's voice was heavy with skepticism and wariness. "Belief is irrelevant, Admiral," the woman whispered. "Success is a matter of probability and application of force. The High King is the mind of this rebellion. Remove the mind and the body will die. Your fleet has battered the body. My task is to pierce the skull." The plan she outlined was one of such audacious insanity that only the desperate or the damned would even consider it. The assassin, who gave no name but the Clade Vindicare designation, Praetoria, would make her way to Hadrian's Spire. She would not infiltrate the hive from the Imperial side, but from the war-torn no-man's land between the armies. Her target was Thraxxan's personal command fortress, a colossal dropkeep known as the Iron Spire that he had landed on a plateau overlooking the Gorgon's Gate, a symbol of his arrogant dominance over the battlefield. To reach this fortress, Corbulo argued, gesturing at the hololith, which now showed a tactical map of Hadrian's Spire, you would have to cross 10 kilometers of open terrain, a kill zone watched by thousands of knights and their thrall soldiers. "It is impossible. My clade does not recognize the concept of impossibility," Praetoria replied, her tone unchanged. "But I will require a distraction, a significant one, something to draw the eye of the king and his honor guard away from their immediate surroundings at the precise moment of my infiltration." The distraction she required was not a simple artillery barrage or a feint. She needed an act of such magnitude that it would command the absolute attention of the entire renegade army. She needed a sacrifice, and on the map before them, there was only one man capable of providing it: Castellan Valerius. The astropathic message sent to Hadrian's Spire was heavily coded and carried the highest imperial authority. Valerius received it in his makeshift medical bay, where Medicae servitors were still grafting synthetic muscle onto his burned flesh. The order was simple and utterly brutal. At a specific hour, 3 days hence, he was to launch a full-scale, suicidal counterattack from the Gorgon's Gate. He was to take every able-bodied soldier, every operational tank, and charge directly at the main Vorlag encampment at the base of the Iron Spire. The objective was not victory. The objective was to die so gloriously and loudly that no one, not even a king in his god machine, could look away. Valerius read the order, his face impassive. He had sacrificed regiments to hold the gate. Now, the Imperium was asking him to sacrifice his entire army and himself for a single assassin's shot. It was the cold, cruel logic of the Imperium distilled to its purest form. He looked at the faces of his veterans, men and women who had fought and bled beside him, who saw him as a savior. He was being ordered to lead them into the jaws of certain death for a cause they would never understand. Without a word, he signed his assent on the data slate. His duty was not to question, but to obey. Cadia had taught him that. The final 3 days at the Gorgon's Gate were a flurry of grim activity. Ammunition that had been hoarded for weeks was distributed. The last reserves of fuel were pumped into the tanks. The Will of Iron, Valerius's battered Baneblade, was hastily repaired, its main gun replaced, its hull still scorched and blackened from the Void shield blast. The soldiers, sensing the finality in the air, did not despair. They sharpened their bayonets, wrote final letters to family they would never see again, and attended solemn services led by the few remaining Ministorum priests. They trusted their Iron Castellan. If he was leading them out into the fire, it was for a reason. They would follow him to hell itself. Meanwhile, a single, unmarked drop pod, launched from a stealth frigate lurking at the edge of the system, burned its way through the upper atmosphere of Hadrian's Spire. It crashed unnoticed into the toxic sludge of a chemical sump miles from any active war zone. From the wreckage, a single shadowy figure emerged, clad in a chameleonic stealth suit. Praetoria, the Vindicare assassin, began her long, silent journey across the corpse-strewn landscape. She was a scalpel, aimed at the heart of a king, and her path was being paved by the ordered sacrifice of 100,000 lives. The most desperate gambit of the war had begun. The pre-dawn air of Hadrian's Spire was a choking cocktail of cordite, promethium, and atomized death. For a single surreal moment, a hush fell over the battlefield. Then, from within the shattered maw of the Gorgon's Gate, a single war horn sounded. It was not the arrogant bellow of a knight, but the mournful, defiant cry of a Leman Russ command tank. It was the signal. What emerged from the gate was not an army, but a tide of pure, suicidal rage. At its head was the Will of Iron, Castellan Valerius standing resolute in its open cupola, his scarred face illuminated by the flickering warning lights of his command vehicle. Behind him came everything the Hive had left to give. Battered chimeras and hellhounds surged forward, their engines screaming in protest. Columns of guardsmen, their faces grim beneath their helmets, charged on foot, their bayonets fixed, their lasguns already spitting futile defiance at the distant metal giants. It was the last act of a dying world, a final glorious scream into the uncaring void. High above, in the command sanctum of the Iron Spire, High King Thraxxan Iron Hand watched the scene unfold on his hololithic display. He had been roused from his strategic planning by the sudden, unexpected charge. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face as he watched the tiny icons of the Imperial forces swarm out onto the glassy plain his knights had created. "Fools!" he boomed, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "The insects have finally broken. They throw their lives away in a final, pathetic gesture of defiance." He turned to his honor guard, the Knights of the Royal Lance, their colossal machines standing silent vigil around the fortress. "Baron Malgast, you have thirsted for this Cadian's blood. Go, take your lance, crush this rabble. I want the wreckage of his tank, brought to me as a trophy." Malgast's Knight Crusader, Iron Vengeance, bowed its massive head in assent. With a roar of its own war horn, it strode from the base of the spire, followed by 4 other knights. They met the Imperial charge head-on, a wall of adamantium and firepower against a wave of flesh and faith. The battle was a massacre on an apocalyptic scale. The knights' weapons tore obscene furrows through the charging ranks. Thermal cannons turned squads of guardsmen to ash. Avenger Gatling cannons shredded light vehicles and infantry alike. But the Imperial forces did not stop. They charged over the bodies of their comrades, driven by Valerius's cold, clear orders, their only goal to close the distance. They were dying in their thousands, but they were accomplishing their mission. They were a spectacle of such magnificent, pointless courage that every eye on the battlefield, from the lowest thrall soldier to the High King himself, was fixed upon them. No one noticed the flicker of movement at the base of the iron spire. No one saw a shadow detach itself from the wreckage of a fallen armiger and begin its ascent up the fortress's sheer iron-plated cliff face. Praetoria, the Vindicare assassin, moved with inhuman grace, her sinskin suit mimicking the color and texture of the pitted metal, her magno-clue grips finding silent purchase. She was a ghost, climbing towards the heart of the storm, shielded by the thunder of the battle below. On the field, Valerius was orchestrating his own death with the precision of a master composer. The will of iron plowed through the carnage, its guns firing constantly. It became a magnet for the knight's fury. Malgast, his hatred for the Castellan burning hotter than his thermal cannon, ignored the rest of the battle and focused solely on the Baneblade. The two titans began a brutal, close-range duel amidst the swirling chaos. The Iron Vengeance fired, its shell striking the Baneblade's forward armor and rocking the super-heavy tank on its tracks. The Will of Iron fired back, its demolisher cannon blasting a chunk of armor from the knight's leg. Meanwhile, Praetoria had reached the upper levels. She moved through the fortress's superstructure like a phantom, her Exodus rifle held at the ready. She bypassed sentry servitors with short-range hypnopulses and slipped past guard patrols in moments of calculated darkness. Her destination was the High King's throne room, a place no enemy had ever breached. The final confrontation began almost simultaneously. On the battlefield, Valerius realized his tank could take no more. Its engine was overheating, its ammunition was nearly spent. He had drawn Malgast into the perfect position, a clear field of fire away from the main melee. "All power to forward shields," he commanded. "Gunner, one final shot. Aim for the head." Then he keyed the command box for a general broadcast, his voice ringing out across the Imperial lines. "Cadia stands for the Emperor." The Will of Iron fired its last shell. At the same moment, the Iron Vengeance unleashed a full volley. The Baneblade's shell struck the knight's head, shattering its cockpit canopy and sending it reeling backwards, stunned. Malgast was momentarily blinded, his controls sparking, but his return fire was devastating. The Baneblade was hit by a thermal cannon blast and a full salvo of missiles. It simply disintegrated, its hull breached, its ammunition and fuel detonating in a single cataclysmic fireball that consumed Valerius and his crew. The symbol of Imperial defiance was gone. At that exact moment, Praetoria reached the viewing portal of Thraxxan's throne room. She saw the High King standing, his back to her, watching the destruction of the Will of Iron. On his hololith, a triumphant roar building in his throat. This was the moment the probability of success was at its zenith. She raised her Exodus rifle, the targeting laser a pinpoint of invisible light on the back of Thraxxan's neck, right where the spine met the skull. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The shot never came. Thraxxan, possessed of the lightning-fast reflexes that had made him king, felt something. Not a sound, not a sight, but a subtle shift in the air pressure, a cold spot on his neck. His instincts, honed by a century of war, screamed at him. He moved, not a full turn, but a fractional sidestep, a mere instant before Praetoria fired. The turbo penetrator round, designed to punch through ceramite and bone, missed its mark. Instead of obliterating his spine, it tore through the thick muscle of his shoulder and smashed into the command throne behind him. The impact was still immense. Thraxxan was thrown to the ground, his arm a mangled ruin of flesh and broken bone, screaming in a mixture of agony and pure animalistic rage. The assassination had failed. Praetoria, her mission compromised, did not hesitate. She fired a second shot at the throne room's main power conduit, plunging the chamber into darkness and chaos, and melted back into the shadows from which she had come. Down below, the Imperial charge faltered and broke. With their leader gone, their will was shattered. They were now just a panicked mob to be slaughtered at the knight's leisure. Thraxxan, bleeding and incandescent with fury, dragged himself to the command console of his knight tyrant, Oathbreaker, which stood dormant in the throne room's center like a sleeping idol. With his one good arm, he activated the awakening rites. The god machine's eye lenses flared to life with malevolent red light. His voice, twisted by pain and fury, boomed through the voxcasters of every knight on the field. "They tried to slay a king!" he roared. "They sent a shadow to break our will. Now they will feel the wrath of a god." The entire side of the Iron Spire blew outwards as the Knight Tyrant Oathbreaker smashed its way onto the field. It was a walking avatar of destruction, its plasma decimator glowing with terrifying energy, its thunder coil harpoon crackling. Thraxxan, wounded and maddened, was no longer a general. He was a berserker. He ignored the routing Imperial soldiers and strode towards the only target worthy of his rage, the smoking, burning wreckage of the Gorgon's Gate. He would not just win this battle, he would personally erase the Hive from existence, beginning with the gate that had defied him for so long. The desperate gambit had failed, and in its place, it had unleashed an apocalypse. The failure of the assassination attempt and the death of Castellan Valerius was not merely a setback, it was the breaking of the final seal on a cataclysm. The calculated fury of the Iron Crusade transformed into the indiscriminate, nihilistic rage of a wounded demigod. High King Thraxxan, his arm a mangled ruin temporarily encased in a pain-suppressing stasis clamp, was now a being of pure vengeance. His mind, once a nexus of grand strategy, had narrowed to a single burning purpose: to make Hadrian's Spire a monument to the price of defying him. From the command throne of Oathbreaker, his pain-laced roars became the only orders his knights needed. The strategic objective of capturing the Hive was abandoned. The new directive was simple and absolute: extermination. The final, apocalyptic assault on Hive Primus began not with a charge, but with a sentence of death delivered from the muzzles of 1,000 god machines. The Knights of Vorlag, their bloodlust stoked by their king's fury, formed a semicircle around the Hive, a firing line miles long. On Thraxxan's command, they opened fire as one. It was a barrage of such overwhelming power that it defied comprehension. Volcano cannons, thermal destructors, and plasma decimators fired in a continuous rolling thunder that shook the planet to its core. The Hive's upper spires, already weakened by weeks of siege, began to collapse in on themselves. Entire sections of the city, each home to millions, were sheared off, falling for miles in a slow-motion avalanche of ferrocrete and human life, their descent ending in mushroom clouds of pulverized dust that rose to blot out the sky. The very air caught fire, turning the space around the Hive into a vortex of superheated ash and screaming wind. This was not a battle, it was a geological event. The remaining defenders of Hive Primus were no longer fighting an army. They were trying to survive the death of their world. Regiments were wiped out not by enemy fire, but by the ground beneath them ceasing to exist. Command bunkers deep in the Hive's foundations were crushed by the weight of the collapsing city above. The organized defense of Hadrian's Spire ended in a matter of minutes, replaced by the panicked individual struggles of billions of people trying to outrun the end of their world. Through this man-made apocalypse strode Thraxxan in his Knight Tyrant. He marched directly towards the Gorgon's Gate, the symbol of his frustration, firing his weapons indiscriminately. The plasma decimator on Oathbreaker unleashed pulsing orbs of contained starfire that vaporized bunkers and melted curtain walls into rivers of glowing slag. His thunder coil harpoon fired, its barbed tip punching through the adamantium gate itself, and with a shriek of protesting metal, he tore a huge gaping hole in the fortress that had defied him for so long. As the gate was breached, a new figure of defiance emerged from the smoke and ruin. It was not a soldier, but a machine. The Baneblade, Will of Iron, its hull a blackened and twisted wreck, its crew incinerated, was not entirely dead. Its machine spirit, an ancient and belligerent intelligence forged in the fires of the Omnissiah, had survived. Driven by a final, desperate protocol of vengeance, its secondary systems activated. One of its sponson-mounted heavy bolters, miraculously intact, began to fire, spitting a stream of shells at the foot of the approaching Knight Tyrant. It was an act of sublime futility, a flea biting the ankle of a leviathan. Thraxxan did not even register the impacts. He raised the massive foot of Oathbreaker and brought it down on the ruined Baneblade, crushing it into a heap of compressed, smoking metal, finally silencing the heroic machine spirit within. But that final act of defiance had a purpose. It had distracted the king for a precious few seconds, and it gave the true, final defender of the gate his chance. From a hidden sally port near the base of the gate, a single figure emerged, clad in the scorched and battered carapace armor of Akkadian Kasserkin. It was Castellan Valerius. He was not dead when the Will of Iron had exploded. The force of the blast had thrown him clear, his augmented body and heavy armor absorbing just enough of the impact to keep him alive. He was a ruin of a man, his body a patchwork of third-degree burns and shattered bones, kept conscious only by a massive dose of combat stims and the sheer inhuman force of his will. In his hands, he clutched the tank's detonator, a device linked directly to the Baneblade's unstable warp core reactor. He had seen the assassination fail. He had seen his army die. He knew the Hive was doomed, but Cadians did not yield. He staggered forward into the very shadow of the Oathbreaker and held the detonator high. "Cadia stands!" he roared, his throat raw, his voice barely a croak, but imbued with all the hatred he possessed for the archenemy of mankind. Thraxxan, his attention drawn by the cry, looked down. His knight's augurs zoomed in on the lone, broken figure. For a moment, the High King was confused, seeing the ghost of the man whose death he had just witnessed. Then he saw the device in the Castellan's hand, and he understood. He raised his knight's foot to crush this final, infuriating insect. He was too late. Valerius thumbed the activation rune. The reactor of a Baneblade is a caged star. When the containment fails, it does not explode in the conventional sense. It unleashes its energy in a silent, blindingly white wave of absolute annihilation. The detonator's signal, reaching the crushed and destabilized reactor core of the Will of Iron, directly beneath the Night Tyrant's foot, triggered this release. There was no sound, only light. A sphere of pure white energy erupted from the ground, engulfing both Valerius and the Oathbreaker. Valerius was simply gone, his sacrifice absolute, his atoms scattered into the maelstrom. The lower half of the Night Tyrant was vaporized instantly. The colossal machine, its legs and torso erased from existence, toppled backwards, its upper half crashing to the ground with the force of a meteor strike. The command throne and High King Thraxxan Iron Hand with it was crushed into an unrecognizable lump of adamantium and flesh. The psychic shockwave of the High King's death, a silent scream of agony and disbelief, washed over his entire army. The Knights of Vorlag, in the midst of their destructive revelry, faltered. The unifying will that had driven them, the charismatic fury of their king, was suddenly gone. A profound confusion settled over them. Their charge was broken, their purpose lost. The bombardment of Hive Primus stuttered and died out as night after night ceased firing, their pilots trying to comprehend the yawning void that had just opened in their command structure. The siege of Hadrian's Spire was over. The objective had been achieved. High King Thraxxan was dead. But the cost was a world. Hive Primus was a charnel house, a toppling, burning tomb for its billions of inhabitants. The planet's surface was a sea of fire and craters. The once mighty Hadrian PDF was a memory, and its savior, Castellan Valerius, was a smear of ash on a glassy plain. It was a victory, but one so catastrophic, so absolute in its devastation, that it was indistinguishable from the most profound defeat. The death of a king is not an event, it is a fracture. For the Knights of Vorlag, Thraxxan Ironhand had been more than a commander. He had been a prophet, the living embodiment of their crusade, the singular will that had forged 1,000 competing egos into a single, unstoppable spear. With his obliteration in the fires of the Will of Iron's vengeful heart, that spear did not just dull, it shattered into 1,000 jagged shards. The immediate aftermath on Hadrian's Spire was a scene of stunned, eerie silence. The thunder of the knights' guns, which had been the planet's heartbeat for weeks, ceased. The great machine stood motionless amidst the seas of fire they had created, their pilots isolated in their command thrones, feeling the sudden, chilling absence of their king's psychic presence in the new sphere. The Iron Crusade, an entity of pure momentum, ground to a halt. Confusion swiftly curdled into conflict. The ancient feudal rivalries that Thraxxan's Iron Will had suppressed now erupted with volcanic force. Baron Malgast, his knight's cockpit shattered and his face a mask of bloody fury, was among the first to react. He declared himself the rightful heir to the High Kingship, his claim based on his position as Thraxxan's most favored champion. He broadcast a simple, brutal order: consolidate around my banner. We will finish this world and then carry the king's vengeance to Terra itself. But his authority, born of Thraxxan's patronage, was now hollow. Baroness Vorla, the Red Widow, whose Reaver fleets had been harrying the sector's outer edges, received the news of the king's death with cold calculation. From the bridge of her flagship, she denounced Malgast as a reckless fool whose obsession with the Gorgon's Gate had led the king to his doom. She declared herself the new leader of the crusade, advocating a more pragmatic strategy of raiding and consolidation over bloody head-on assaults. House Harkon, which had bled itself white against Valerius's defenses, refused to follow either. Their Baron, Drex, his pride in tatters, declared the crusade a failure. He announced his house was seceding from the alliance and would retreat to Vorlag to defend their homeworld from any imperial retribution. This was the spark that lit the fuse. Within hours, the unified army of the Iron Crusade had fractured along the ancient fault lines of House Allegiance. The civil war began on the corpse of Hadrian's Spire. Malhas loyalists, flying the king's banner, turned their weapons on the knights of House Harkon as they attempted to disengage and retreat to their transports. The glassy plain before the Gorgon's Gate, already a graveyard of Imperials, now became the site of a fratricidal brawl between god machines. Knight fought knight in duels of breathtaking violence. Their weapons, once turned on a common enemy, now tearing apart their brethren. A knight crusader loyal to Maljast ripped the arm from a knight paladin of House Harkon with its thunderstrike gauntlet, only to be blasted apart from behind by another of Harkon's lances. The beautiful, savage knights of House Phelan, watching the brutish Vorlag houses tear each other apart, simply disengaged. Their High Baron, Tybalt, saw not a setback, but an opportunity. With the Iron Crusade in chaos, his own house was now the preeminent renegade power in the sector. He ordered his forces to abandon the Hadrian system and begin carving out their own personal fiefdoms in the undefended eastern territories. The shattered front was a cancer, metastasizing across the Argentum Reach. The once unified fleet of the Iron Crusade broke apart. Some ships remained loyal to their respective knightly houses, retreating or redeploying as ordered. Others, their crews a mixture of captured Imperial ratings and Vorlag thralls, saw their chance for freedom. Mutinies erupted, captains were spaced, and ships turned pirate, becoming rogue elements in an already lawless sector. Baroness V. Horla's Reaver fleet, bolstered by defectors and freebooters, became a pirate kingdom in its own right, preying on Imperial and renegade shipping alike with gleeful impartiality. The retreat from Hadrian's Spire was a chaotic, bloody affair. As the feuding knightly houses fought their way back to their transports, they were harried by the few remaining Imperial survivors. Pockets of guardsmen, emerging from deep shelters to find their world a burning ruin, became packs of vengeful ghosts. They launched guerrilla attacks on the retreating knights, using their knowledge of the Underhive's tunnels to stage ambushes. They could not win, but they could exact a bloody price. A squad of veterans, armed with the last of their melta-bombs, managed to bring down a knight valiant as it lumbered towards its dropkeep, their suicidal attack a final, defiant testament to the will of their fallen castellan. When the last of the renegade ships finally lifted from the scarred surface of Hadrian's Spire, they left behind a broken army and a dead world. Less than half of the knights who had landed on the planet would return to the stars. The Iron Crusade had not been defeated by the Imperium. It had committed suicide upon the anvil of its own victory. The grand vision of a new stellar kingdom had dissolved into a bitter, internecine war waged by feuding warlords over the scraps of a ruined sector. The front had not just been shattered, it had been atomized, leaving behind a power vacuum into which something far older and darker was about to creep. In the ebon darkness of the void, far from the burning pyre of Hadrian's Spire and the squabbling of the broken knights, a vessel of an entirely different allegiance watched the unfolding chaos. It was the battle barge, anointed in blasphemy, a relic of the Horus Heresy, its hull encrusted with 8-pointed stars and screaming faces forged in soul iron. For months, it had lurked in the silent depths of the Argentum Reach, a predator observing the frantic death struggles of lesser beasts. Aboard this vessel, Dark Apostle Vorgath of the Wordbearer's Legion smiled, his teeth filed to needle points as he reviewed the final reports from his covert agents. The isolation of Vorlag had not been an accident of the Great Rift's birth. It had been an act of deliberate, meticulous sorcery. The sanctified host, Vorgath's warband, had spent decades seeding the warp currents around the night world, using ancient rituals and the sacrifice of 1 billion souls on a forgotten moon to subtly guide the rift's tendrils. They had created the prison that had fostered Thraxxan's resentment and pride, the whispers of a restored stellar kingdom, the rediscovery of the lost ancestral maps, the simmering resentment against the Oathbreaker, Imperium. All of these had been carefully cultivated. Operatives of the host, disguised as itinerant pilgrims and freelance chartists, had planted these ideas in the courts of Vorlag's nobility generations ago. They had stoked the fires of Thraxxan's ambition, nurtured his arrogance, and praised his strength, all while cloaking their influence in the guise of his own burgeoning genius. The Iron Crusade was not Thraxxan's creation, it was Vorgath's masterpiece, a perfectly crafted weapon aimed at the heart of the sector. Thraxxan had been the perfect pawn, proud, strong, and utterly blind to the subtle machinations of the warp. He believed he was fighting for a kingdom of honor and iron. In reality, he was a sacrificial blade, wielded by the Chaos Gods to bleed both the Imperium and the Renegade Knights white. Every life lost, whether Imperial guardsman or noble scion, every prayer of desperation from the besieged, every cry of vengeful fury from the attackers, had been a tribute to the Dark Gods. The immense slaughter on Hadrian's Spire had not just been a battle, it had been the crescendo of a sector-wide ritual of blood sacrifice. The psychic anguish of a trillion dying souls had saturated the region, weakening the veil between reality and the warp to a threadbare sheet. The board is cleared. Vorgath hissed, his voice like the slithering of snakes over dry bone. He stood on the bridge of his battle barge, surrounded by the hulking, crimson-clad forms of his chosen. Before them, a coven of bound psychers screamed in unison, as their minds were forced to project a hololithic map of the sector. The map was no longer marked with Imperial or Renegade icons, but with the swirling, corrupting runes of the warp. The proud fools have bled each other into irrelevance. The corpse emperor's dogs are broken and scattered. The stage is set. The timing was perfect. Admiral Corbulo's fleet was shattered. The renegade knights were scattered, their houses turning on one another in a bitter civil war. The Imperial garrisons on a dozen worlds had been wiped out. The entire Argentum Reach was a power vacuum, a feast laid out for a patient predator. "Begin the incursion," the Dark Apostle commanded. "Unleash the faithful. Let the true crusade begin." From the cavernous launch bays of the Anointed in Blasphemy and its hidden escort fleet, a new wave of invaders descended upon the tormented sector. These were not the gleaming, honorable knights of Vorlag, but a tide of damnation. Drop pods shaped like iron coffins screamed through the atmospheres of worlds already reeling from the war. On their scorched hulls were the leering daemon faces and blasphemous litanies of the word-bearers. From them emerged not noble warriors, but 8-foot-tall transhuman monsters clad in crimson ceramite, their bolters roaring prayers to the ruinous powers. They did not strike at the heavily defended core worlds. They fell upon the planets already ravaged by the Iron Crusade, the worlds whose populations were starving, whose defenses were broken, whose faith was a flickering ember. On the agri-world of Gethsemane Prime, where the knights of House Phelan were brutalizing the populace, the word-bearers appeared as liberators. They fell upon the Phelan knights with disciplined fury, their Havoc squads crack missiles and las cannons, finding the weak points in the knights' armor with practiced ease. The enslaved farm workers, seeing one set of metal tyrants being slaughtered by another, were offered a simple choice by Vorgath's apostles. Swear allegiance to the primordial truth and be saved, or cling to your false emperor and die. Millions, their spirits broken, knelt in the mud and began chanting the praises of chaos. The whispers of a new war, a new power, spread like a virus. Cults that had lain dormant for centuries erupted into open rebellion. Demagogues rose on hive worlds, promising food and deliverance to the desperate masses, their sermons twisting into praises of the dark gods. The Iron Crusade had been a war between two factions of humanity. This new conflict was a war for humanity's soul. The word-bearers were not just conquerors, they were converters. They erected gore-soaked altars on the sites of imperial cathedrals. They turned refugee fleets into mobile temples of chaos, their twisted priests promising a new age of strength and freedom from the tyranny of the corpse emperor. The psychic energy from these mass conversions, combined with the lingering death agonies of the previous war, began to have a tangible effect. The stars themselves seemed to dim. Minor warp incursions became commonplace. On the haunted plains of Hadrian's Spire, the billions of unburied dead began to stir, their bodies animated by demonic entities drawn to the sheer scale of the slaughter. The Iron Crusade had been a fierce, terrible storm, but it had only been the herald of the true hurricane. As the forces of the sanctified host spread through the Argentum Reach, it became terrifyingly clear that the war between the Imperium and the Renegade Knights had been nothing more than a bloody prelude, a meticulously planned opening act for a far grander and more horrifying drama. News of the unfolding catastrophe in the Argentum Reach reached Segmentum Solar not as a coherent report, but as a psychic death rattle. The entire sector's astropathic choir, already strained to the breaking point by the Iron Crusade, screamed once in a unified chorus of unimaginable terror and then fell silent, their minds comprehensively and simultaneously erased by the blossoming chaos incursion. This chilling silence was a more potent alarm than any plea for aid. It signified a strategic collapse on a scale that demanded the attention of the highest authorities. A relief force was mustered with a speed that spoke of utter panic among the administratum's upper echelon. This was not a ponderous crusade fleet that would take a century to assemble. It was a surgical strike force, a collection of the swiftest ships and most ruthless warriors available. At its head was not a lord militant or a fleet admiral, but a figure who operated beyond such conventional chains of command. Inquisitor Lord Valeriana, a woman whose name was a byword for cold, brutal pragmatism even within the Ordo Malleus. Her flagship, the Black Ship, Soul's Verdict, was an omen of the grim work to come. When Valeriana's fleet translated into the Argentum Reach, the view from the bridge of her vessel was one of a sector in its death throes. The warp was so turbulent that navigation was a nightmare, and the Geller fields of her ships flickered and groaned under constant assault from incorporeal entities. Systems that were marked on her charts as loyal Imperial worlds were now broadcasting hymns to the dark gods on all frequencies. Others were simply dark, their populations silenced, their worlds becoming charnel houses for the word-bearers' grisly rituals. The surviving renegade knights had been driven to the sector's fringe, where they had devolved into warring packs of pirates, fighting the forces of chaos and each other over the scraps of their failed kingdom. Valeriana was not a savior. She was an exterminator. Her mandate was not to reclaim the Argentum Reach, but to contain the infection before it could spread to the neighboring sectors. She deployed her forces with the dispassionate precision of a chirurgeon amputating a gangrenous limb. The word triage was on every order she issued. Her first act was to declare the entire outer sector, including the renegade homeworlds of Vorlag and Phelan, as perdidas. Lost. They were to be abandoned, their populations and resources given over to the enemy. Imperial forces were forbidden from even entering the zone. Instead, she established a new, heavily fortified border within the sector itself. This new line of defense stretched from the bastion world of Fortis Majoris, which had miraculously held out against the initial chaos, to the heavily industrialized system of Orestes, a subsector Forge World complex. This new border was christened the Valerian Line, an unwitting and bitter irony named for the Castellan, whose sacrifice had bought the Imperium this one. Final chance. The consolidation was a brutal, bloody affair. Valeriana's forces, a grim coalition of Cadian shock troop remnants, fanatical sisters of battle from the Order of the Bloody Rose, and a full chapter of the Minotaur's Space Marines were tasked with holding this new line at all costs. They were not to reclaim lost ground. They were to turn the worlds of the Valerian line into fortress worlds of unparalleled strength. Meat grinders designed to bleed the advancing forces of chaos for every inch of ground. The process of scouring the worlds just outside the new border was horrific. Valeriana authorized the use of cyclonic torpedoes on 3 worlds that were deemed too far gone to chaos worship to be salvaged. From the view screen of the Soul's Verdict, she watched impassively as the torpedoes struck the planet of Gethsemane Prime. The world that had once fed a subsector cracked apart, its atmosphere ignited, its surface scoured clean of all life, both the corrupted and the innocent. This was not war, this was pest control on a planetary scale. Refugee fleets that had escaped the initial cataclysm now found themselves trapped. Those who had made it to the comparative safety of the Valerian line were subjected to brutal purges by Valeriana's inquisitorial stormtroopers. Entire ships were declared tainted and their populations executed without trial, their bodies burned on colossal pyres that lit the orbital stations. A soul's innocence was no longer a defense. The mere possibility of corruption was a death sentence. The Argentum Reach, once a productive and loyal sector of the Imperium, was being systematically dismantled by its own protectors. The sector was effectively shrinking by half, its outer territories sacrificed, and its border worlds turned into a permanent, festering war zone. The Minotaurs were unleashed upon the renegade knights who had been caught on the wrong side of the line. The arrogant, honor-bound warriors of Vorlag and Phelan found themselves facing a foe as implacable as they were, but utterly devoid of chivalry. The Space Marines did not engage in duels. They hunted the knights with cold, professional savagery. Thunderhawk gunships would harry a knight, forcing it into a canyon where Devastator squads armed with las cannons would ambush it from all sides, shearing off limbs and targeting weak points until the god machine collapsed. The knights, already weakened by their own civil war, were systematically exterminated. Baron Malgast, his mind broken by failure and rage, was finally cornered on a barren moon. His knight, Iron Vengeance, was brought down by a mass teleport assault of Minotaur Terminators who swarmed his machine and tore it apart with their thunder hammers and lightning claws. The scouring was a success, but only by the most brutal definition of the word. The chaos incursion was contained. The advance of the word-bearers slammed into the Tamian, newly fortified Valerian line, and the war bogged down into a grinding, endless siege. The Argentum Reach was saved from total damnation, but it was now a shadow of its former self, a scarred and truncated stump of a sector, its name becoming a byword for sacrifice and loss throughout the segmentum. Valeriana had saved the body by amputating the limb, leaving a weeping, incurable wound where a productive part of the Imperium had once been. In the century that followed the scouring, the Argentum Reach ceased to be a place and became a scar on the face of the galaxy. It was a permanent, festering war zone, a testament to the cost of pride and the price of survival. The Valerian line, once a hastily drawn border on a hololithic map, became a physical reality of trenches, void fortresses, and gun batteries that stretched across a dozen star systems. It was a new Cadia on a smaller scale, a place where generations were born, fought, and died without ever knowing a single day of peace, their only purpose to hold back the tide of damnation that beat ceaselessly against their walls. The legacy of the Iron Crusade became a tripartite legend, each part a different shade of grim darkness. For the wider Imperium, it was a cautionary tale, a sermon delivered by Ministorum priests on the dangers of pride and the folly of breaking oaths to the god emperor. Thraxxan Ironhand's name was entered into the Librum Maleficus as an arch-heretic, a symbol of ambition curdling into treason. His quest for a kingdom had brought nothing but ruin, his arrogance paving the way for a far greater evil. The Crusade was remembered not for its initial shocking victories, but as the bloody prelude to the coming of the sanctified host, a brief secular war that had been but the shadow before the true darkness fell. On the worlds of the Valerian line, the legend was one of sacrifice and martyrdom. Castellan Valerius was posthumously canonized by the ecclesiarchy. Saint Valerius the Adamant, the Iron Castellan of Hadrian Spire, became the patron saint of the Argentum Reach. Miracles were attributed to him. Guardsmen in desperate last stands would whisper his name as a prayer, and tales were told of his ghostly, battered Baneblade appearing on the battlefield to turn the tide of a hopeless fight. His final words, Cadia stands, became the battle cry of the entire sector, a declaration of defiance shouted into the maw of eternal war. The world he had died to save, Hadrian Spire, was now a quarantined death world, its ruins haunted by the restless dead and prowled by the demonic spawn of the warp. Yet pilgrims would still travel to the system's edge to offer prayers to the martyred saint who had held the gate. Beyond the Valerian line, in the lost territories now known as the Wastes of Vor, the third and most tragic legacy festered. The Knights of Vorlag and Phelan were not entirely extinguished. A few houses, battered and broken, managed to retreat to their homeworlds, but there was no kingdom to return to. Their worlds, cut off from the Imperium and hounded by the forces of chaos, descended into a state of perpetual savage warfare. The grand dream of a new stellar empire had died with Thraxxan. In its place was only the bitter reality of their folly. They were trapped, damned by their own choices. No longer noble warriors, they became reavers and pirates, their once gleaming knights now rust-streaked and adorned with crude icons of their own despair. They fought chaos warbands, rival houses, and orc freebooters with equal ferocity, their quest for a glorious kingdom leaving them with only a legacy of ash and an endless, pointless war for survival in the darkness they had helped to create. Their honor was a forgotten memory, replaced by the gnawing hunger of scavengers fighting over a corpse. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted in a small yet significant way. A once stable sector was now a permanent drain on the Imperium's resources, a bleeding wound that would never fully heal. The word-bearers of the sanctified host had gained a major foothold in the Segmentum Solar, a launching point for future incursions. Dark Apostle Vorgath, his plan a resounding success, looked out from the bridge of his battle barge upon his new domain of tormented worlds, and saw not an ending, but a glorious beginning. And so the story of the Iron Crusade came to its definitive, grimdark conclusion. It was a saga of immense scale, born from the pride of a single king that had consumed 1 trillion lives and shattered a sector. It ended not with victory or defeat, but with the establishment of a new, miserable status quo. It left behind a legacy of ash, a canonized saint born of unimaginable slaughter, and a damned people forever cursed to wander the ruins of the kingdom they had sought to build. It was another bloody verse in the endless tragic epic of the Sachebilst millennium, where every victory is paid for in blood and sorrow, and the only certainty is war.